would like to call to order this ad hoc committee on student assignment. We don't have to take roll or anything of that effect, do we, by name, right? We can kind of just jump into our presentations. Okay, cool.
I'm sorry, yes, Commissioner.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so then we will start with item B1 and kind of begin with the presentation.
Thank you so much, Commissioner Bogus. And good evening, commissioners. My name is Orla O'Keefe, and I'm joined this evening by Joseph Minardo, Marisha Robinson, Professor Irene Lowe, and many others who are working together to help us implement the board's new policy for assigning students to elementary school. Next slide, please. And thank you in advance, Ms. Leno, for helping us with this.
You're welcome.
So every year, the board's ad hoc committee on student assignment meets to monitor and strengthen the district's approach to school enrollment. As we know, this is every family's first point of entry to the district, and we want to make sure that it's as accessible as possible and also meeting the board's objectives. Since 2018, the board has focused on changing how students are assigned to elementary schools. And in 2020, the board approved a new policy. So the focus of the ad hoc committee for this year is working to implement that policy. Changing student assignment is like turning an ocean liner around. That requires a lot of thought and moving parts. And once a policy is approved by the board, it takes quite some time to effectively shift to create the change that's needed to implement it. And we're in the middle of that right now. And so we see these meetings, the ad hoc committee meetings, as incredibly important. We see them as our opportunity to work with the board. So we always think of them as working sessions, and that at the onset of it, we provide some content and then provide the board with questions to help guide the discussion. And we hope that at the end of the meeting, we will have received input that will help us move the work forward. So that's really the purpose of these ad hoc committee meetings. And we as staff prepare for them and always look forward to them, and they help guide our work moving forward. So thank you to the commissioners. I know you're all incredibly busy. There's a lot going on, and so we appreciate your time. Before I move on to describing the outline for tonight, I want to highlight a couple of things. On the right-hand side of the deck, there are links to a variety of artifacts that we think are super helpful for families and board members to learn if they want to get a quick update on what's our current policy, because it's important to understand the current context, but then also the policy development materials. So if there's anyone that's new to the conversation or re-entering it for the first time in a while, we encourage you to click on these links that are provided here. And there's also some additional resources in the appendix. Next slide, please. So here's an outline of tonight's staff presentation. It's been organized primarily to help the board and public understand and provide input, which is most important, on the processes and tools we're using to draft the zones. And throughout that, we will preview how the community input will be used to inform the approach that we take. The work of drafting zones is incredibly complex. It'll be a paradigm shift, as I mentioned, and we believe it'll help create more equitable access to opportunities in SFUSD. We see lots of connections between a zone-based student assignment policy, zero-based budgeting, facilities, capital planning, efficient and effective transportation, and a more equitable and cost-effective distribution of special education pathways and language pathways. However, to realize all of that potential, we must first draft zones for consideration. And that's what we're focused in on this evening, how we're proposing to draw those zones. So we're going to start by providing a quick policy background and project update. We'll then give an update on the fall community engagement, and we'll then talk about how we're going to use that to draft the zones. And we'll close by looking ahead and thinking, what does the rest of this year look like? And how will we engage together as a board and staff on that? Next slide, please. So to help guide the discussion, we thought it would be really helpful at the start of the meeting to share with the board what the questions are that we have for you throughout tonight's discussion. These questions won't make sense right now because we haven't shared the content, but as we're going through the content, we will surface up these questions, and then at the conclusion of the meeting, we'll resurface them again so that the board can have them as a prompt for the discussion. So a couple of the questions have to do with measures for diversity, and then a couple of questions have to do with how we will work together as an ad hoc committee meeting for the rest of this school year. Next slide, please. I'd now like to introduce Joseph Monardo. He's our technical project manager, and he'll provide the context and update and introduce the next presenters following him. So with that, I'll pass it off to you, Joseph.
Thank you, Orla. Good evening, commissioners, and to everyone who's here with us. Thank you to the members of the public for sharing this time with us. Today's meeting is the latest checkpoint within several years of work, so I'd like to begin with a brief reminder of the policy background. Next slide, please. Okay, so SFUSD is working now to implement a new student assignment policy because the current policy isn't working as intended. And the 4 topics on the left-hand side of the screen describe some of the current problems. First, our current system of district-wide choice has resulted in segregated schools and a pattern where African-American, Latinx, and Pacific Islander students attend schools that have higher poverty rates on average. Second, the current system places a burden on families to find and choose their school, and that burden isn't felt equitably. It can be especially harmful for families who don't have the resources to explore every school option or who don't have reliable daily access to transportation. For all families, the current process causes stress and anxiety, in part because of the uncertainty about where their student will ultimately be assigned. Third, because students travel across the city in unpredictable patterns to get to their assigned school, the current system creates a disconnect between schools and the neighborhoods that they're located in. And finally, the current system of full choice results in some schools ending up with lots of extra space and seats and too few students, which can make it difficult to use resources efficiently. We also think there's an opportunity to encourage more San Francisco families to attend SFUSD schools. So we need to make sure that the enrollment system helps families easily access SFUSD schools that they feel good about. I will say here that we know these problems cannot be fully solved by only introducing a new assignment policy. Some of them stem from deeper issues of residential segregation and inequality, both of which are connected to racism in San Francisco and in the broader American and global context. We know that every family wants supportive, inclusive, and affirming learning environments for their children, and that all of our work needs to be focused on that goal, on making it possible for every family to find that. So the new student assignment policy can and does support that objective. And those of us presenting here tonight with some of our team members will be working with parents and colleagues over the next 2 years to make sure that all schools are ready to provide that type of experience. Now, the specific goals outlined in the Board Policy 5101.2, which set the path for the implementation work we're doing now, is shown at the right-hand side of the screen. So the new student assignment system needs to pursue 3 goals: diversity, predictability, and proximity. So that means we want schools to be diverse, we want the process to be understandable for families, and we want students to be able to go to school close to their home. Next slide, please. Okay, so now I recap the policy background and I'll provide a brief summary of how the new system will actually work. The new policy has 3 main features or elements: zones, diversity categories, and tiebreakers. Zones, I'll speak to first. I call them the defining feature of our policy because we're moving from a system of district-wide choice to choice within zones, or sometimes we say a zone-based policy. Schools will be organized into zones, and students will be able to apply to schools that are in the zone where they live. So you can see here a colorful map of San Francisco. It's color-coded based on a hypothetical set of zones. So these aren't proposed zones or even potential zones. but a model of kind of what this zone-based approach could look like. So after schools are organized into zones, then diversity categories and tiebreakers influence how students are assigned to schools in their zone. And I should say how students get assigned to one of the schools within their zone. Diversity categories are a new element that's not in our current policy, but is a way for us to ensure that each school ends up with diverse enrollment based on enrolling students from different types of neighborhoods in each zone. Tiebreakers are something we use currently, and we'll continue to use a simplified version of tiebreakers. So we'll have three: one for siblings, one that we're calling an equity tiebreaker, and one to pre-K students, to students who attended pre-K in SFUSD. Okay, next slide. So moving on to share a high-level timeline of our work, the first thing I'll highlight is that this change that we're discussing today isn't immediate. The policy change is complicated. As Orla said, it will have a really big impact on San Francisco families and on every aspect of SFUSD schools. So we need to make sure that we're getting it right. The new assignment system will impact students entering SFUSD for the 2024 to 25 school year. So that means the enrollment cycle that opens in October of 2023. The apples you can see in the bottom corner of this slide show when the new student assignment policy will begin. Now, coming back to the present, you can see the star where we are now, transitioning from fall to winter in the 2021 to 22 school year. So the work we're focused on most heavily right now is drawing zone boundaries, because so many of the other details associated with our policy need to be based on that important set of information. During our previous ad hoc committee meeting in September, we did discuss a preliminary version of the equity tiebreaker. So, we are doing work to prepare ourselves for all of these tasks at the same time. As the assignment policy development team, we're actively working with colleagues throughout SFUSD to think strategically and collaboratively to handle these work streams. So like transportation and potential changes to programs and pathways are two examples of that. There are a lot of things to do within this implementation phase. So we're building partnerships and using them to make sure SFUSD is able to do what's required. Next slide, please. On the topic of partnerships, I also want to highlight the various research partners who are contributing to our work, often in ways that are really transformative and really crucial. There are 4 main research teams outlined in the table on this slide. The first team at the top is one you'll actually hear from in a few minutes and is led by Professors Irene Lowe, who's here with us today, and Itai Ashlagi of Stanford University. Among other things, they are producing simulations that will help us, the district staff, and the board members and members of the public understand how the technical policy elements could and should work. So they work closely with us to tailor their work to our objectives, to district objectives, and to feedback from the public. And they're developing the techniques and products that are leading us to maps of different zone boundaries. The other 3 teams are not part of today's presentation, but each is contributing something unique and valuable to the district and to this student assignment policy change work specifically. So I'll speak to them briefly. Professors Damon Clark and Paco Martorell are working closely with the Educational Placement Center to better understand how and why parents choose schools. Professor Nilafar Salehi and PhD student Tanya Nguyen, along with a team of other UC Berkeley researchers, are working closely with the community engagement team to make sure our new student assignment system ultimately works well for the families who will use it. And Professor Sebastian Martin, Arthur Delarue, and Jen Lien have worked with SFUSD's transportation department to expand our ability to model different scenarios of student transportation and school access. So all 4 of these teams are investing their time and energy to make our work as productive and excellent as possible. So I wanted to share all of that work with the ad hoc committee tonight. Now I will invite the community engagement manager for student assignment, Marisha Robinson, to continue our presentation, and we can move to the next slide.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Marisha Robinson, and I'm the Community Engagement Manager working on this team. Next slide, please. So here we have a timeline about our process for informing and engaging with the community. So conversations with the community and other stakeholders is a continuous process, but in each step of this process, we're building on what the community is giving us in feedback and input as we develop our zones. This fall, we're gathering, as highlighted there in the yellow, we're gathering input to inform the drafting of zones. And that will happen in the winter of 2022. And then once we get those zones drafted, we are going to bring them back to the community in the spring of 2022 to also get feedback and input before we go through finalizing our zones. The plan is to finalize our zones by May of 2022. Next slide, please. So we wanted to share a little bit about the journey participants take when attending our workshops and our community conversations. Workshops were designed to be a conversation with the community, and we were intentional to give foundational knowledge and an overview of the new policy. We then provided framing that used the goals and values and the outcomes of the new policy. So after setting the tone through our framing and our education, we're able to go into small group discussion. This is where participants spend the bulk of their time with us is in these conversations. Small group conversations were intentionally designed to elicit feedback and input that would directly inform the drafting of zones. After collecting some additional data through surveys, participants were then returned to the main group and provided resources to stay connected to the work at various levels, anywhere from commenting during public comment at board meetings and signing up for our email listserv. Next slide, please. We've heard a little bit about what the participants do and their journey through our workshops. And through this process, it couldn't have been possible without our community partners, and I want to highlight some of them there. And also another part of our workshop design and scheduling was ensuring that our workshops were hosted in multiple language. And I'm proud to say that I've learned how to say good evening in Cantonese and Spanish. And I know how to read the chat that says the chat does not work in both languages, or we cannot access something. Our workshops could not have been a success without our community partners, such as our foster family advocates, the 2nd District PTA, our African American Parent Advisory Council, the SF Parents Coalition, the Parent Advisory Council, Wu Yi Children's Services, the Latino Task Force, and Mission Graduates. We are still in the process of conducting fall workshops, and we look forward to finishing our engagement with the following community partners: the families at our Buena Vista Horace Mann Stayover Program, the Samoan Community Development Center, the Community Advisory for Special Education, San Francisco Unified School District's Early Education Department, the African American Early Education Policy Council, and the African American Early Childhood Educators Group. We also have a survey and handout in all 7 languages that's designed for those who could not attend our workshop to provide input that our partners at Parents for Public Schools will help disseminate to a wide range of families. Next slide, please. So here are some of our upcoming meetings. We invite the public, the community, and the board to join us at an upcoming workshop if you haven't been. The link to sign up is linked in the deck. You can go up to bit.ly/S workshops REG, all one word, to join us at an upcoming workshop. Next slide, please. Before we hear from our researchers, I'd like to share the questions in detail that we discussed during our workshops. So our first topic was diversity. So it's important to understand how the community would like to see diversity measured within zones. The community was presented with 2 different approaches, and it was all discussed within small groups. And during those conversations, we invited participants to offer input and create creative solutions towards creating diverse zones. Next slide, please. Our second topic was size and distance. This was an opportunity where we were listening to participants' needs around traveling to and from school and where priorities might lie when it comes to how close their ideal school was located. Participants were able to dive deeper into what we know to be true about the size and distance of zones that are drafted, and that is that there will be continued access to programs and pathways and that all zones will be contiguous. As with the diversity approaches, the input and feedback we received will directly inform the drafting of proposed zones. I'll now pass it on back to Joseph to continue our presentation.
Thanks so much, Marisha. Okay, so I'm just going to briefly step in to introduce the district's research partners who will present tonight. So we can go to the next slide. All right, so I'm happy to be able to introduce Stanford professor Irene Lowe and PhD students Kaylee Menser and Mobin Yayazadeh Jelodar. These representatives are part of a team of Stanford researchers.
Yeah.
Part of a team of Stanford researchers who have been supporting our work through expert technical skills and with real deep collaboration, for which we're very fortunate and grateful. So Marisha just provided an update on our ongoing efforts to gather input from the community throughout this fall. You can see that a step in the timeline on this next slide, and we can move to the next slide. So you can see the fall community engagement is a step in this timeline. The subsequent step in that process, which is highlighted in yellow here, includes using the community's feedback to draft potential elementary zones. That's what we'll do with the Stanford team this winter. Tonight, the team of researchers will describe that process of building zones and describe how community feedback might be used during that process. Now, I'll invite Kaylee Menser to continue this presentation.
Thank you and good evening. Next slide, please. Our goal today is to illustrate our process for building elementary zones and how we might incorporate community and board input into the process. The way we build zones is that we put together small geographic building blocks into groups to form larger zones. We will show some hypothetical zones today, which will show this process using attendance area building blocks. Right now, we're working on using census block groups as building blocks for drafting elementary zones. Census block groups are smaller than attendance areas, which will provide more fine-grained control over the zones and will likely result in zones that look different than the ones we'll show today. To build zones, first we decide how many zones we should create. Then we can put together building blocks into ways that follow a pre-specified set of rules. These rules help us control what the zones look like. For example, one rule that comes from the board policy 5101.2 is that in each zone, the proportion of students eligible for free and reduced price lunch is within 15% of the proportion of eligible students district-wide. Depending on how we set the other building rules, we can come up with many different zones that have different characteristics. Building zones is computationally difficult because changing which zone a single building block belongs to could result in carry-on effects that require changing all other zones to meet the rules. Working with smaller and more numerous building blocks requires more such adjustments, which makes building zones slower. So one area of focus for our current research is to speed up the computation so that we can use smaller census block groups instead of the larger attendance area building blocks. Next slide, please. To get a bit more concrete about what these zone building rules might look like, I'll provide a few examples of rules we might follow. First, we ensure that blocks are put together in ways that keep zones contiguous, because in prior discussions with the board, you've been clear that you want zones to be contiguous. Furthermore, we could set rules such that each zone has about the same number of students and that the schools within each zone must have enough capacity to accommodate those students. A distance rule could ensure that zones are not too large. The current round of community engagement will inform which types of rules on distance we might want to incorporate into our zone building. For example, a rule that ensures that a zone is no more than 6 miles across might produce large zones, whereas a rule that ensures that no zone is more than 5 miles across would produce medium-sized zones. The current community engagement workshops will also inform which types of rules we should incorporate to capture diversity. We are currently soliciting community feedback on 2 specific types of zone diversity rules: approach 1, representativeness, and approach 2, avoiding overconcentration. An example of approach 1, trying to build socioeconomically representative zones, is to use a rule where we must make every zone have a proportion of students eligible for free and reduced price lunch as close as possible to the district average. Another example that we've been discussing in community engagement is to have a very strict rule, like ensuring that the proportion of students eligible for free and reduced price lunch is within 5% of the district average. An example of approach 2, what a rule might look like for avoiding socioeconomic concentration of disadvantage, could be that we must put together zone building blocks in ways that ensure that the proportion of students eligible for free and reduced price lunch is within 15% of the district average. Once we've selected a set of rules, we then can pick the best available set of zones based on a weighted combination of chosen target measures, such as distance or balance of students eligible for free and reduced price lunch. Next slide, please. Now that we've discussed how we build zones, we're going to demonstrate the trade-offs that arise from how we set these rules. We'll look at a few different hypothetical zones to demonstrate the trade-offs between the 2 different approaches to diversity: representativeness and avoiding overconcentration. Specifically, the measure we're going to look at today captures socioeconomic diversity by looking at the proportion of students in each zone eligible for free or reduced price lunch relative to the district average. You can think of this as a measure of socioeconomic disadvantage. Approach 1 is to seek zones that are as representative as possible. And we can do this by finding the zoning that makes the zones with the highest and lowest socioeconomic disadvantage as close as possible to the district average, so that the overall degree of difference between the zones is as narrow as possible. Approach 2 is to avoid overconcentration of socioeconomic disadvantage in any zone, and this can be achieved by requiring that each zone have a proportion of students eligible for free or reduced price lunch that is within 15% of the district average. Approach 1 is likely to find zones that balance the proportion of students eligible for free and reduced price lunch more evenly across zones. However, approach 2 gives more flexibility to improve other metrics, such as distance, since there are more options for zones that are within the wider 15% window, but not quite as balanced. Now, Mobin will show a set of hypothetical zones to illustrate this trade-off. Next slide, please.
Good evening, everyone. In the following, I would like to compare the 2 different approaches Kaylee talked about by showing different hypothetical zones. Here are 2 hypothetical zonings that divide the city into 6 zones. We call them large zones. We form these zones by using one of the 2 different diversity rules we mentioned: approach 1, representativeness, and approach 2, avoiding concentration. We fix every other rule, for example, zone size, contiguity, balance of students and seats, and distance to stay the same. Let's look at how these hypothetical zones trade off between diversity and distance. We see that approach 1 gives us zones with better diversity while sacrificing the distance. To be more precise, using approach 1, we found zones where each zone has a proportion of students eligible for free and reduced price lunch within 4.3% of the district average. You can think of this as all zones being roughly balanced in socioeconomic disadvantage. And the average distance of students to the center of their zones was 2 miles. On the other hand, using approach 2, each zone has a proportion of students eligible for free and reduced price lunch within 14.2% of the district average. So we've avoided zones that concentrate socioeconomic disadvantage, and we can reduce the average distance of students to the center of their zones to 1.62 miles. Next slide, please. There's a lot of information on this slide, so let me orient you to what we've added. First, we repeated the process I described on the previous slide to form zonings dividing the city into 9 zones. We call them medium zones, and you can see them on the right of the screen. We then calculated the same measures of socioeconomic diversity and distance for the medium zones. We put the results for approach 1, or representativeness, in the top table, and the results for approach 2, or avoiding concentration, in the bottom table. For both large and medium zones, representativeness finds hypothetical zones with better diversity, but worse distance. In the pink boxes, we can see that using representativeness gives large zones that are within 4.3% of the district average eligible for free or reduced price lunch. And avoiding concentration gives large zones that are less socioeconomically balanced, but still within 14.2% of the district average. In the green boxes for medium zones, this comparison is now 12.2% for representativeness, compared to 14.1% for avoiding concentration. One thing that's worth noting is that for medium zones, the difference in diversity is much smaller, as approach 1 did not find medium zones that were as balanced as the large zones. To have a better sense for these numbers, in the last column, we show the same measure of diversity for the middle school feeder zones. You can see that with the middle school feeder zones, there are zones which have a proportion of students eligible for free and reduced price lunch that is 24% away from the district average. In fact, there are several zones that have at least 20% more or 20% fewer socioeconomically disadvantaged students. So you can see that all of the 4 hypothetical zones we are showing today are much more socioeconomically diverse than the middle school feeder zones. Next slide, please. You might have noticed that all the measures we've shown you so far are for zones. But what we are really caring about is how diverse schools are and how far students have to travel to schools. To answer this question, we used historical choice to predict how students would choose schools, simulated assigning students to schools using these predicted preferences, and looked at measures of diversity and distance at schools. One measure of socioeconomic diversity of schools is the percentage of students eligible for free or reduced price lunch. You can think of schools in which this number is more than 15% above the district average as high poverty schools. We predict that only about 6.7% of schools in the large zone and 6.4% of schools in the medium zones are high poverty schools when we use approach 1. We can also look at this measure for approach 2, avoiding concentration, in the bottom table. Now, slightly more schools are high poverty schools, specifically 8.1% in the large zones and 9.1% in the medium zones. To get a better sense for these numbers, in the last column, we showed the same measure of diversity for the assignment of students to schools in 2018-19. In that year, 20% of schools were high poverty schools. Again, we can see that all of the 4 hypothetical zones we are showing today give more socioeconomically diverse schools than the actual assignment in 2018-19. Now, let's look very briefly at distance metrics. We computed the average distance of students from their assigned schools for all the hypothetical zones. And again, see that representativeness improves diversity at the expense of distance, with the students traveling on average 1.53 miles in the representativeness zones compared to 1.43 miles for zones that avoid concentration. Next slide, please.
Thank you very much, Mobin and Kaylee. Let me summarize what we've shown you today. We've shown our process for building zones and how we might use this process to incorporate community feedback. Concretely, we formed hypothetical zones that illustrate the trade-off between the two approaches to diversity you see at the top of this slide: representativeness and avoiding concentration. These are the two approaches to diversity that are being discussed currently in community engagement. We find that representativeness improves diversity measures at the expense of other metrics, such as distance. We also see that this trade-off is general. We see it both for medium and large zones, and also both with diversity and distance of zones and diversity and distance of the assignment of students to schools. Next slide, please. So what we showed today was simplified to just two measures of diversity: representativeness and avoiding concentration. One question we want to ask the board today is whether there are other measures we should be considering. Let me first explain why we chose to compare these two measures of diversity. We chose representativeness as it is potentially one of the first measures that many people think of when they think of diversity. And we measured socioeconomic diversity or socioeconomic representativeness today by asking that each zone have a proportion of students eligible for free or reduced price lunch that is as similar as possible to the district average. We chose avoiding concentration as a measure because this type of diversity is supported by research on educational achievement. For example, recent research from Stanford shows that the concentration of minority students in high poverty schools is correlated with large achievement gaps. For example, large opportunity gaps for Black students, Latinx students, or Pacific Islander students. This suggests that one goal would be to ensure that we don't concentrate minority students in high poverty schools. We could do this by reducing the number of high poverty zones or high poverty schools. And so that's what we did today by ensuring that each zone is within 15% of the district average of students eligible for free or reduced price lunch. We could also look at how often minority students are assigned to high poverty schools. For example, we can only consider zones that result in fewer than 10% of African American, Latinx, or Pacific Islander students being assigned to high poverty schools. In addition, we have also considered other measures of diversity. For example, we might want to avoid isolating minority students in schools with very few students like them. For example, by looking at the percentage of African American students who are assigned to a school with at most 3 other African American students. We might also think that it's helpful for students from different backgrounds to interact with each other. In the research on diversity, this idea is called exposure. And we might want to look at, for example, the exposure of African American students to white students or vice versa. Next slide, please. I also want to briefly comment on how we're incorporating the different characteristics of diversity that are in the board policy on student assignment. Today, we focused on socioeconomic diversity as measured by eligibility for free or reduced price lunch. We also consider other socioeconomic measures, including using median household income or poverty in building zones, and looking at redlined areas of the city and public housing as we draw boundaries and think about the diversity categories and equity tiebreaker. Thinking about other characteristics, we use a similar approach to the one we showed today to incorporate racial diversity. For example, as measured by the percentage of African American, Latinx, or Pacific Islander students, as well as academic performance, which we currently include using a composite measure that also includes poverty level and median household income. In addition, we are also using the same process we showed today to form zones for language programs and special education programs. Once we form the zones, we can consider all these characteristics of diversity when we evaluate these zones. We evaluate the assignment of students to schools that is produced by each set of zones. And this allows us to be conscious of all characteristics when evaluating trade-offs between zones. Next slide, please. We're still in the process of forming zones using census blocks, census block groups as building blocks. So our main goal for today was to inform the board and any community participants about our process for forming zones and to illustrate concrete trade-offs between the two approaches to diversity that are being discussed in community engagement. As we continue drafting zones, there are two questions where we especially appreciate board input. They're on the slide here. First, which aspects of the two diversity measures discussed today resonate with the board? Do you prefer the approach of representativeness or avoiding concentration? Second, do these two approaches capture what the board means by diversity? Or are there other diversity measures that are important to use in evaluating zones? I will now hand things back to Ms. O'Keefe to talk about next steps.
Sorry. Thank you so much, Irene and Kaylee and Mobin. Your partnership really is invaluable. As you know, the district is incredibly resource constrained, and it's because of your work that we're able to apply such rigor and thoughtful approaches to developing zones that are aligned with the board's policy goals. So thank you so much for that. Next slide, please. And you can jump to the next slide as well, please. Thank you. So as I mentioned at the onset of the presentation, there's a lot of work that we're doing, and there's a lot of work we as a district have to do to realize the vision and hope that's outlined in the board's resolution for a new elementary student assignment policy. We're very focused this school year on developing zones because we recognize that there are a number of aspects of the implementation of the policy that rely on the foundational piece of developing zones. So, and as Joseph mentioned, while it's our focus that we're driving towards, we are simultaneously working on a bunch of other interrelated pieces. But what I'm laying out here in this high-level timeline is focused on the zone development. So as Marisha shared, we're gathering input from the community right now, and we're going to be finishing that by early December, and then spending some time synthesizing and reflecting on that input, surfacing up highlights and insights, and incorporating that into the elementary zones using the model that Irene and Kaylee and Mobin have just shared. And so we're hoping that by the end of February, we will have draft zones and a review of the middle school feeders to share with the board and with the community. And then at the end of February, we'll launch our next round of community engagement to get input and refine the zones. And then the goal is to finalize the zones by May and June, wrapping this part of the work up before this school year ends. So that's at a high level, kind of the work streams around and the general timelines for developing the zones. Next slide, please. So there is a lot that's to be accomplished. We're hoping that for this school year, we'll finalize the elementary zones, the diversity categories, and the tiebreakers. And so we'd like to request with the ad hoc committee that we could meet monthly starting in January, and that during those monthly meetings, we would discuss findings from the community engagement process, look at draft zones, get feedback from the board before we actually bring them out to the community, and discuss access to language pathways, special day classes, and K-8 schools, discuss the middle school feeders, and again, revisit and continue the discussion about diversity categories and tiebreakers. And that's a lot of content to work on with the board, which is why we're suggesting and requesting that we could meet monthly starting in January. And then next year, if we accomplish these goals for this school year, next year, our objectives and major deliverables would be thinking through the transportation strategy, developing the enrollment infrastructure, which is going to be huge. That's everything on the front end and on the back end. So think about that in terms of how families will engage with information, how we'll share information with them. And then on the back end, the algorithm and all the systems that are going to be needed to actually make the assignments to families. And then finally, but most important to the success of this, is managing the change within SFUSD. We do not want to be in a situation where we're trying to roll out a new system, and our staff and our school secretaries and the EPC and on all those that touch it are not aware of and informed about and supported with information about this change. And that includes our CBOs and all the amazing partners that we have. So there's a tremendous amount of work, change management work, that needs to happen once we've actually landed on the zones and have the infrastructure ready to implement. Next slide, please. So these are the questions that are more about how we're going to work together as a board and staff over the rest of the year. And so we'd love to hear back from the board on this ask that we meet monthly. And then we'd also like to know which specific aspects of the work the board would like us to focus on during the different meetings. We suggested some topics, but would love to work with you on building out the scope and sequence for next year, for the rest of this year, sorry. Next slide, please. So that concludes our presentation, and here are a summary of the 4 questions that I surfaced at the beginning of the meeting as well. So what are the aspects of the 2 diversity measures discussed today that resonate with you? Do you prefer the approach of representativeness or avoiding concentration? And then the second question is, are there any other diversity measures that are important for us to capture? And then the final 2 questions are about how we're going to partner and collaborate as a board and staff with this complex work for the rest of the year. And next slide, please. We move into the appendix. Just wanted to highlight that because there's lots of links to other resources that the board and the community might be interested in. And that concludes our presentation for tonight, and we look forward to discussing it with the board. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the presentation and for the slides and the information. I think what we'll do is, before we go to public comment, we'll see if there are any technical or clarifying questions from commissioners before we let the public have a go. And I think what we'll do for public comment is we will give the public a minute to give public comment. And I think, if this isn't offensive to the fellow commissioners, we'll give people an opportunity to give public comment before our comments or after our comments. Just to say, so if people want to give public comment before, then they can start raising their hands. If people want to give it after we have given our comment as boards, then you could also do it then. But I will start with my points of clarity, then I'll go to Commissioner Lamb, and then we'll go to Commissioner Vice President Maliga, and we'll ask, maybe if folks can just ask 1 or 2 clarifying questions, and then we'll go to the public comment. Okay, so my clarifying question is really around kind of the way we're defining high poverty schools and minorities, just kind of with us being a minority free reduced lunch district, with us being 15% white. How are we kind of navigating those kind of conversations, and how should the public understand when we talk about that things, what do we actually mean for our district and how that will play out?
Thank you, Commissioner, for that question. It's a complex question, and I'm wondering, Irene, do you want to share what we've been, how we've been approaching it so far?
Yeah. So first, when we think about high poverty schools and minority students, we've been kind of looking at definitions that come out of the research on education and educational gaps. And so those are often not necessarily in districts like San Francisco, where there is a very large proportion of students who are African-American, Latinx, or Pacific Islander, and where there's a very large proportion of students who are eligible for free reduced price lunch. And so we kind of took those terms from this other context. And then I think the specific definition today of high poverty schools, those schools that are 15% above the district eligibility for free reduced price lunch, is not the only definition we could give of high poverty schools. It was just a useful sort of benchmark. We've also looked at, for example, schools that are above 10% of the district average. And so what we're really looking at is concentration of socioeconomic disadvantage, and we can vary the extent to which we call it concentration.
And thank you for that answer, Irene. I will just add that version of the definition of high poverty correlates really nicely to the language in the board policy that requires each zone be within 15% of the district average in free and reduced price lunch. So again, to clarify, Irene was talking about kind of at the school level using that same version of the definition, but I think there is at least a logical tie, but certainly that's not the only way one might define high poverty zones or schools. And then when it comes to speaking about minority or any racial group, often we as staff will try and name the groups that we're talking about as precisely as we're able. So at times you'll see us speak about AALPI students or families to include African American, Latinx, and Pacific Islander families.
Could you share which groups you're specifically, I guess, including in your initial thoughts? Like, is it Asian students? Is it Chinese students? Is it Southeast Asian students? Or is that not something that we've kind of actually dived into yet? I guess I'm just curious for the public as they kind of think about us as we talk about these things, who are we trying to prioritize and kind of ensure we don't have over concentration or under concentration?
So there are a couple of dimensions to it, Commissioner Bogus. So when we think of our focal students, and when we're talking about students that we want to make sure that, because there's drawing the zones, but then there's also the tiebreakers, the equity tiebreaker for our focal students. So when we look within our district at our achievement outcomes and we see where there's the greatest opportunity gap, it is for our African American, Latinx, and Asian Pacific Islander students. So we place tremendous, we recognize that as the focal students that the board is consistently through the resolutions that you've passed and various ways that you demonstrate, plus our Vision 2025 and the district's commitment to overcoming historical inequities for our students. So that's when we talk about our focal students, that's in particular what we're talking about. And then I don't know, is that the question you were asking, Commissioner?
It is, and I guess I'm just trying to make sure that when we say focal students, that would be the same as saying our minority students, as was listed in the presentation, or is that different?
It's the same.
Yes, it's the same.
Yeah.
Yeah, and in addition, we sometimes also look at for each of those groups, so just African American students, or just Latinx students, or just Pacific Islander students.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. I will let Commissioner Lamb go next, and then Vice President Maliga for your clarifying question.
Thank you. And thank you, Commissioner Bogus, for asking your question. I had a similar question. My questions was related to travel distance, and if the simulations right now only purely include mileage, or were current SFMTA bus routes and overlay to those considerations, because, you know, for example, 2.5 miles by car may be one thing, but 2.5 miles on MTA may be a very different story for travel time.
So thank you, Commissioner Lamb. Transportation is a critical part of this conversation, and we are fortunate that we have a number of people who are looking at things or thinking about things from the transportation perspective. I will let Irene and others expand on what I'm saying, but I would say for right now, what we're looking at is trying to draw zones in a way that are responsive and adhere to the guidelines set forth in the board student assignment policy, and that part of the evaluation of whether or not those zones are zones that we would want to propose and share with the board and the community will be an assessment of the implications for transportation. And so it's part of the conversation. I don't know if others want to elaborate on that, but it's going to be part of the evaluation, just as part of the evaluation will include looking at the number and percent of students with IEPs in each zone, the number of English language learners in each zone. There are multiple metrics that we're going to use to evaluate whether these are zones that we would contemplate presenting and that we'll use to kind of refine the development of it. I'll invite my colleagues if there is anything else they'd like to add in terms of the responding to Commissioner Lamb's question about transportation.
Maybe to respond to the specific question, that's correct. The measures that we're showing today are just looking at mileage. We would like to be able to incorporate more accurate estimates of transportation. So that includes, let's say we have school buses, what would be the bus time to get into school? Also looking at walking time. So there are several other measures of transportation we would like to include, and we are working on that. But all of these different measures take some more time to be able to compute, either because of access to data or because we have to compute it sort of zone by zone after we've come up with the zones. So that's work in progress.
Thank you. That's super helpful. And the second clarifying question is, now that with there are free meals for all, and I think that is originates from the federal government, are we still going to be collecting the free and reduced meal data moving forward?
Yes, Commissioner Lamb, we are, because as you know, the allocation of resources and the local control funding formula, we need to collect it for those purposes. So we're still collecting them. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Vice President Maliga.
Thank you, Chair Bogus. Appreciated Chief O'Keefe and the team for the presentation. Could you all just briefly go over the 4 elements again, please, just bullet point wise, in terms of, I think it was representativeness, avoiding concentration. I think those were actually the 2. Am I correct? Right. Would you be able to just kind of briefly go over it again one more time?
Sure. And I'll invite Irene to do that. And Deborah, if you wouldn't mind, if it's possible to put up slide 26 again, because I think that's what Commissioner Maliga is referring to. Thank you.
Great. So here are the 4 measures of diversity we suggested today. The first is representativeness. You can think of this as asking, how closely do schools mirror the district? So for example, if we were looking at socioeconomic diversity or socioeconomic representativeness, one measure would be having each zone have a proportion of students eligible for free reduced price lunch that's as similar as possible to the district average. So we want our zones to look very similar to each other. Second is avoiding concentration. So the zones don't necessarily have to look that similar as long as they're not concentrating, for example, students with socioeconomic disadvantage or students from certain racial groups. And so instead of having the zones be very similar to the district, they would be avoiding concentration. The third is avoiding isolation. You might think that if we, for example, have a very small population of African-American students, and we try to achieve something like representativeness, then our African-American students may not be able to go to school with those who look like that and are from a similar background. And so we may want to avoid the isolation of students from certain backgrounds. And then the final measure is exposure. There's this idea in the literature on diversity that it's helpful from an educational perspective for students to be exposed to other students from different backgrounds. And also similarly to avoiding isolation, to be exposed to students from the same background as them. And so we can look at these, how much different groups of students are exposed to other groups of students.
Great, thank you so much. I do have other questions, but that was it in terms of clarification. Thank you.
All right, thank you for that, Vice President. We will start with you when we have questions from commissioners next. So now we'll go to public comment, and we will give 1 minute for each person. And for folks who give public comment now, we will not allow you to speak later. It's kind of a one-shot deal. But let's start, please.
Can I have that translated in Chinese and Spanish, please?
favor, levanten la mano si quiere hacer algún tipo de comentario sobre el tema de hoy y recuerden que tienen 1 minuto y que si hablan ahora ya no pueden hablar después, más adelante. Muchas gracias.
如果你想睇在剛才嘅簡報發表意見嘅話咧，就請而家舉手，咁你會係有1分鐘嘅發言時間嘅。咁你而家呢個發言咗咧，就之後咧就冇得再發言嘅。好，唔該晒 ，thank you。
Okay. G. Tun.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, everyone. Here's my question. I'm wondering if there's been consideration to add specifically, sorry, I was on another call, specifically around supports for, not supports, there needs to be something included around teacher qualifications. We know that's a huge factor when we're talking about how schools, the quality of school programs are, and I'm wondering if you can include that somewhere. I jotted down my notes and it might live somewhere with programmatic. I think I captured that, but I'm curious, has there been dialogue or conversation around that? Because what tends to happen is that you have your most qualified teachers going where? Not in the schools who are underserved, but in communities that are of high affluence. So I would love for that to be included someplace.
Carla.
Hello, everyone. Thank you. My name is Carla Bobadilla. I am the membership chair for the Community Advisory Committee for Special Education. I'm also a para. I just thank you, Commissioner Lamb, for pointing out about filling out the free reduced lunch application form. What I'm hearing from families is that it is hard to navigate. It's all on parent view. In the past, it used to be a paper form that came home. Teachers could catalog who returned what forms. They could follow up easier. Now it's all in parent view. So we have some families that are having trouble just filling out the emergency contact. And then also being uncomfortable with putting personal information, social security, et cetera, on a website. At least that's what I'm hearing. So I just want to make sure that we are tracking parent view and the percentage of which schools are actually getting those forms, so that if we're basing a lot of this zoning on that's a really key piece. And then my other comment is just on special education students. I know that's another nitty-gritty detail. We have special day classes that are set up specifically, like our DHH, our deaf and hard of hearing, have panels, acoustical tiling. We have speakers in rooms. So it's those particular programs. Are those students going to be placed first, or are they going to be subject to zones? So one school that might have a DHH program might not have the same program at another. So thank you. Sorry.
Thank you.
Alita.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for this presentation. And as always, thank you for the work. My main question is on slide 6. It's probably more of a comment, where we state that unconstrained choice has contributed to under-enrollment or has undermined confidence in schools. The joint advisories actually posit exactly the opposite. It's not unconstrained choice. It's the way we have implemented bond funds, retrofits, it's family engagement and fundraising and PTAs and things like that. So what are we going to be doing within the zones to account for that? First of all, as the joint advisory committees have been saying for years. And secondarily, I think that one of the big issues that was mentioned by Chief O'Keefe as we started was zero-based budgeting and how this fits into our fiscal crisis right now. We have to cut $125 million from our budget in order to not go under, to not be taken over by the state. How does this process align with our current budget constraint? Thank you.
That's it, Commissioner. Oh, I have SFUSD PAC.
Yeah, please, let's take one more.
Go ahead.
2 more.
PAC. They're not answering.
We did have one more hand pop up as well, so I don't know if you want to call on them.
Rhonda? Ryanda Is that how you say it? I'm sorry.
Sorry, I didn't get the prompt to unmute until just now.
Sorry.
But good evening, everybody. Let's see. Sorry, I'm a little all over the place. I'm making the baby's dinner, but thank you, team, for all of the hard work. I did want to echo Lee's comment and just ensure that when we're making the zones and that we're looking at the free and reduced lunch, that we're also making sure that we're still breaking it up so that all the schools have equitable access to the resources. Because even if we are basing it, in my understanding, on the free and reduced lunch, then that may create another issue where you're still going to have schools that aren't broken up, and you're still going to have the overly resourced schools if we're basing it on the parents' income, right? And so we just want to make sure that all of our babies have equitable access, so we're not running into the same issues where we have the PTAs that are extremely strong and they can support nurses and teachers on the parents' incomes without having to touch the school resources at all, right? So we want to, when we're spreading that around, to make it equitably spread around so that all our schools have the same access. Thank you.
I'd also, we need to invite Michelle Jack Menendez as a panelist so she can speak, because so if you wouldn't mind doing that, Ms. Lenoff.
What was the last name?
I think it's SFUSD PAC. We want to
Okay,
activate.
all right.
Thank you for that, Orla.
Mm. Okay, she's been promoted.
I got it, Ms. Lenoff. Yep.
Michelle?
Hi, yes, thank you so much. Thank you, Orla, and thank you, Deborah, for that. Appreciate it. Michelle Jacques Menegas here with the Parent Advisory Council. I want to echo basically everything that the previous callers have talked about. And I did want to also highlight and appreciate the inclusion of the factor of whether or not kids would experience isolation, because we do have populations of students in our school who have in the past, I would say, been placed in school sites to provide that diversity factor for other kids, but who then experience isolation. And there's a whole series of problems with that. So I really, really appreciate that being highlighted in this. Thank you so much, all of you, for your work.
That's it, Commissioner. I don't see any other hands.
All right, thank you. So we'll go to questions and comments from commissioners. I think what I will ask is if Vice President Maliga would start, and if we can maybe have you ask maybe one or two questions, then we go to Commissioner Lamy. We'll have y'all kind of jump back and forth for a little bit. And I'll save my questions for last. So please, why don't you get us started?
Thank you so much. Question for the team. How does the new enrollment process level set enrollment throughout the district, right? Will all schools have like an equal amount of enrolled kids in schools, right? Or how will that look?
Thank you, Commissioner Maliga, for that question. So one huge piece of this work of developing zones is having an understanding of our facilities and knowing what's the capacity of our facilities. So not only which facilities we should include in zones, but what our assumptions should be around the number of students that each facility can accommodate. And that's something that we're working with the facilities team with. So that's one of we mentioned that there are lots of partnerships. That's one of the partnerships. And I know that our Chief Facilities Officer sees this work as really important to the facilities and capital planning and all of that. So under our current system, it's really kind of strange the way capacities are set and students are distributed. Demand has a lot to do with it. So we look at historical demand patterns. So you might see that there are some schools that have a large facility, but we only set like the enrollment at like 40 for the entering kindergarten class. And we work really, really hard to get 2 classes. And we sometimes just end up with one entering class of kindergarten students. The way we're imagining, and the other challenge that we have with our current system is that as we need to develop and implement and roll out new SDC pathways, special day classes for our students with IEPs, there's a huge tension between it's difficult to identify sites where we can place those as the need arises. We've also got our TK expansion that's happening right now, and thinking about how do we make sure that we have universal TK and what might that look like. So as we're developing our zones, there's a couple of things we're correcting for. So one of those is we're coming up with some guidelines around capacity setting, and we're thinking that depending on the size of the facility, we should contemplate how many classrooms would be set aside for students with IEPs, for special day classes, how many seats should be set aside for TK, and building kind of a enrollment in a logical, transparent way across the system, trying to calibrate our number of students, our enrollment projections with our facilities, and then thinking about what adjustments we need to make to facilities in order to make sure we're aligning both. And that's something that under our current system is just not obvious or transparent, or it isn't how we approach it. Once we start constraining choice, it's going to force us as a district to rethink all of the decisions that we mightn't necessarily think through right now. So that's one of the advantages, is kind of calibrating facilities with enrollment projections and with need for programs. Another is thinking about our language pathways. So under our current choice system, we had, when language pathways were first introduced to the district, and we were starting to distribute them across schools, it's very different than the context today. And so as we're thinking about drawing zones, it'll be a great opportunity for, taking having equity at the center, but also thinking about it from an efficiency and effective perspective, right? Thinking about where do our English learners live? Where are these programs located? What are the demand patterns for these programs? How can we make sure that we're offering them in a way that's affordable for us as a district, and maximizing opportunities for families? So what we're imagining is, if we have these zones and we're thinking strategically about the facilities in those zones and the schools that are in those, and we draw them in a way to create a tight alignment between the two, our hope is that we'll move away from a district that has severely under-enrolled schools, while at the same time we've got schools that are bursting at the seams and that have bungalows in the yard to accommodate them, while we've got others where we're underutilizing the facilities. So that's part of the promise of moving to elementary zones. It's going to surface up all of these big questions for us as a district, and provide us with an opportunity to calibrate the two. And I hope I answered the question, Commissioner Malika, about kind of balancing enrollment and facilities in a zone environment.
Chief O'Keefe, you did, and it probably also spills into the next question I'm going to ask you. Will each zone be able to offer similar resources or services to families? So that way, say a family who's in a specific zone and wants to be in another zone, will they be able to know that they have, say a similar language pathway in that zone?
That's our intent, Commissioner, and it's going to mean that we need to make shifts, right? Our current context is not equitable. Our current context has opportunities distributed with different geographic patterns, right? And so we need to disrupt that regardless of the student assignment system we have. That's a call to action for us as a district. We can't keep maintaining a system that's not equitable. But I think having zones provides a predictability and an accountability that doesn't exist with our current system. And so my assumption is that as we start drafting these zones and preparing them to share with the board and staff and the community are going to say, well, in order to make them equitable, this needs to be true, and that needs to be true, and these shifts need to happen, and those shifts need to happen. And that'll be a beautiful thing, because we need that anyway. And we should be having those conversations anyway to ensure that every family, no matter where they send their child to school, they have an opportunity to have a great educational experience and feel treasured and nurtured. And so we don't see this as just student assignment. We see student assignment causing a ripple effect and creating a framework for other decisions that we as a district need to make anyway.
Thank you. That sounds very promising. I have one more question, but I'll pause.
Commissioner Land.
Yeah, I just have a comment. I think just overall, and thank you, Orla, for really speaking to this call to action as a district that we know that we've been needing and wanting to prioritize. And so without, sounding like the broken record, I think a couple of things come into play that I just wanted to acknowledge again. In addition to the student assignment, the programming discussions we'll have for the remaining of the school year as we develop these zones, this is why it's so important to have at minimum the 3, and what we're working towards is a 5-year fiscal projection. And tied to that fiscal projection, that 5-year fiscal projection is also student enrollment. Now, I acknowledge that we can't always, have it exactly right, predictability as far as our student enrollment, but I do think, for example, knowing our data points and our trends, right? That we have had 5+ years now of decreased student enrollment. And what does that mean as we both plan fiscally as well as the capital plan? And certainly when we talked about this over this past, several months around the bond dollars, I think, again, acknowledging how important that capital plan is to the district and its future of both not only realizing the student assignment, but truly that our school facilities are able to match the student population, and that they're modernized, and they are, school buildings where teaching and learning is really going to be continue to be inspiring. So that's why I just wanted to acknowledge as far as when it comes to how this all ties back into the fiscal solvency and stability for the district.
Thank you, Commissioner. And, Dawn, Kamala, Nathan will be in future conversations around this as well, because we've spent a lot of time talking about the work around capital planning and how needing to know what it is we're designing for, how many students, where do they live, what kind of programs do we want to offer. So I think that's going to be key. And we are going to, once we have a set of zones that we think, once we start evaluating zones, one of the evaluations will be the fiscal implications. And thanks again, I can't thank enough Irene and team for all they're doing. Complimentary to the district. I just have to say it without sounding crude, but this is all the work they're doing is not costing the district any money. It's a partnership of service that's amazing. And so we're really grateful for that. And part of what they've developed is not just a tool that will help us simulate different zones, but also an opportunity once we have those zones to start to evaluate them from multiple perspectives, including choice outcomes. Because even though choice is not one of our, our goals, within the student assignment policy, we of course want to make as many families happy as we can. And so we're looking to see, if we did this zone, what might it look like in terms of family, like where might children end up, and how disruptive will it be to choice patterns, and whose choices would be disrupted, looking at it by race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, language status, IEP, all of those things. But we'll also then be able to take those simulations and do the fiscal impact analysis. So we'll be able to say, if in theory we had these zones, and if in theory the choice patterns were like this and this many students were enrolled, what would it cost per school in order to provide the services? So that's going to be part of the evaluation you'll see over the next few months as we work to develop a proposal.
Vice President Maliga, you want to ask your additional questions?
Thank you. Comment and question. I'm looking at the maps, Chief O'Keefe, and these are like, these maps are not set in stone, correct? Okay.
No, they're not even examples. They're just illustrations, because we're going to use much smaller building blocks, and these are attendance areas, but we just wanted to move away from it being so conceptual it's hard to visualize, to create some illustrations and just for a thought exercise.
Okay, that's really good to know. So my comment was really around like being a parent, having kids in schools. It's like a full experience, right? From pickup to the drop off to even like the after school experience of the kid, right? And so as we're building these zones, for me, what's really important is we're building them in conjunction with our districts, right? Our district supervisors, and being able to have them buy into, our student assignment system. Because, when I go back to this, this notion around the experience, right? Like, are all communities that schools reside in today going to have equitable resources for students, right? That show up there in the mornings and after schools and things like that, right? Because if we're going to start, creating a new system and families are going to be, you know, in different places of the city, right? I want them to be able to have the full experience of what it is to be at a school that is robust, in addition to being in communities that are also robust and resourceful, right? And so I'm just curious to know, like, what is our communication, what is our planning around our enrollment system in conjunction with our allies and partners over at City Hall, City and County.
Thank you, Commissioner, for that question. And I see that Viva Moji is on the call here tonight. And we've been working with her to make sure we're keeping the Board of Supervisors updated on the conversations, informing them, engaging them. And I don't know if Ms. Robinson has anything that she'd like to add in terms of the conversations we were having. I think we've been sharing all of the workshop information with the Board of Supervisors. And I think, you know, moving forward, we'll think about, is there anything in particular we might need to do to make sure they're fully informed and that we're being responsive.
Thank you for that. I guess just to build on that last question, I think for me, it's important that we take supervisor districts into consideration as we build out our zones. And understanding that it's very likely that they might transverse them, but just kind of how that's going to impact them and how that's going to play into it, I think is really important, just because I think when we think about the additional supports that our students need, a lot of that is provided by after-school programs that are funded by the city, and a lot of that is directly correlated to district supervisors. And so for a lot of our community schools work, it's really connected in some ways to the neighborhoods and the districts that they're in. So I would just want to lift that up. One thing I think I just wanted to say, I think at this point in the process, we're at a place where there's a lot of hoping that people will assume that we have good intentions as we kind of go through this process and we're not gonna cause harm to people. And I think I just wanted to convey, like, for me, like that's a big priority, and that creating zones for me means reallocating programs and resources to ensure that the zones are equitable and not kind of being limited by how things are set up now. It means making a commitment to do no harm to families, and to make sure no families feel an increased burden because they kind of fall into a loophole in the zone, and the district kind of doing more to accommodate them, whether it's additional transportation supports or whatever it looks like. I also feel like we really need to have a representation kind of model, but with one that kind of excludes groups below 12% of our population and treats them kind of as special, and kind of treats them kind of in a different way, as well as even more so for groups who are lower than 6%, and really just saying, like, we need to treat these groups differently. And I think also what I haven't really seen included is, I think post the creation of this, like, we need to figure out how we're going to monitor and track and what metrics we're going to use to make sure that we are reaching our goals of equity. Just kind of understanding the city isn't equitable, the city is segregated, the city doesn't treat each side of itself fairly. And so how are we going to kind of overcome that, knowing kind of the different balances? And so I think just really figuring out how we develop supports from our advisory councils and our school communities to really help hold us accountable and to monitor the outcomes as they happen. And with that, I will stop my comment and go to Commissioner Lamb.
Yeah, just thank you. Just adding on to the thread about the importance of, looking at the zones, also acknowledging that the redistricting process is happening right now. And so that will set the lines for the next 10 years. And I believe that the redistricting task force has to submit their final report or decisions by April. So wanted to both ask, and how are we engaging as a district with the zoning process, student assignment through the redistricting process now?
Thank you, Commissioner Lamb. We're actually not. We've been developing it using the guiding principles from the board policy, and using different using those metrics and trying to achieve something that from the district's perspective is going to maximize opportunities, putting our students at the center. And I'm not quite sure what the guiding principles or values are of the redistricting work, but we will certainly look into that. So I appreciate you surfacing it, but just wanted to share it has not been a factor to this point, but we will look into it.
Yeah, well, certainly it should, it's not centered. I do think that it's important for the task force to also understand and know that this process is also moving simultaneously, just as another development, that this is a major development that is citywide.
Thank you for that. Definitely will.
And then they can certainly also share their data. They have a very demographers and consultants who are very experienced. They've, I think, renewed the consultant who worked with them the last time, similar consultants as well. So again, just to name that there are also, I think, opportunities for that partnership and the leveraging of expertise there.
Great.
One thing thank you. And I just also want to acknowledge or just name again, and really excited about all the community conversations and workshops that are going to be held. One thing I just wanted to know and ask, the engagement around DLAC and also the Chinese Parent Advisory Committee. I wanted to ensure or hear from the team about outreach, particularly to monolingual limited English proficient communities, as well as Chinese families.
Thank you for that question. So as we designed and planned the workshops, we tried our best to be sure that we connected with all of the different CBOs and the supports that support our monolingual families and host workshops in languages that were accessible to them. Our plans for interacting with our advisory committees is they're in the works now so that they can also have a part in this process as well. We did not hold a specific meeting for our Chinese Advisory Council in this input for community engagement as well as the DLAC, but we did have representatives from both of those advisory councils help and spread the words for the workshops that were hosted either in Spanish or Cantonese. And that was an outreach strategy of ours, as well as other communication outreach strategies. We look forward, though, to continuing to partner with other organizations to host future conversations and are not yet closing this window on fall conversations. As I mentioned before, with that survey and that sheet for families that were not able to participate in a whole workshop, but still want to give some input and feedback and have some knowledge about the policy as we continue to move on.
So I would just ask then, for example, the workshop with Wu Yi, is that going to be open to co-sponsoring of other organizations that are working? And certainly, again, want to thank Wu Yi. They work, they're a very important organization serving their 0 through 5, but I just think it's really important to be able to hold space. And I hear that the team is open to additional workshops or surveys, but we also know, right, that it doesn't replace, especially for immigrant and monolingual limited English proficient communities, that in person is also goes a long way. So we don't have to take up much time. I'm certainly open to following up with the outreach team, but I just do want to name that I do think it's important for those additional engagements.
Thank you for naming that. I also wanted to add to Commissioner Bogus' comment about repairing the harm and outreaching to communities. I'm really honored to be sitting on a team with folks who were intentional and purposeful about ensuring that our focal families and our students in our community were introduced to a process that was not on the district terms, but instead how real family partnership is supposed to work, and that our workshops were designed to really engage and elicit feedback and input that could directly inform the policy, but also for us to have a conversation where families can tell us how they're feeling, where the community can say what they need from us and what and can continue to remind us of the work that we need to do as a district and as a whole to improve the quality of education for their babies. So lots of pieces and movements and gears are going, but this team is really in support of behind of true community input and feedback and partnership, that partnership piece, right? And giving and getting and hearing and understanding from the community. And we'll do our best to continue those conversations.
Commissioner Lamb, did you have additional questions or comments or reflections?
I just wanted to ask, and Marcia, I appreciate the response, that will the team then commit for additional engagement of Chinese communities and families for beyond surveys, but in-person workshops for this next round of community engagements and conversations?
Yeah.
Can I ask a clarifying question on that? I just want to make sure I understand it. When you say next round, are you talking about in the fall? Or are you talking about before December of this year?
Before December of this year.
Okay, thanks for clarifying that. Sorry, Marisha.
It's okay. What I can commit to is to have a conversation to see what can happen with us. We do want to wrap up some of the engagement so that we can synthesize it and get all the data and the input and feedback. But I am definitely open, Commissioner Lamb, to a conversation, a conversation where we can schedule something and see what can happen for to end this final fall workshop series. And then also to be intentional and purposeful with our next set of setting up meetings and do a two-part conversation. We'll see if we can set something up now, but be intentional about setting the date for the spring as well.
I just want to acknowledge, as a district, that we also have Asian Americans because we have our PI engagements. I just want to also name that we do have Asian American immigrant communities, monolingual, limited English proficient families that are also living in poverty and also facing many challenges as well. So I just wanted to at least name that again. Wu Yi, I know, has been an anchor partner, particularly for 0 through 5 families, but I just wanted to also acknowledge some of our other partners that have been instrumental in supporting our families through the years for many decades for school-aged children.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Commissioner Lamb. I guess I would just want to second that and also say if we are not able to kind of have like a formal process, if, even as a commissioner, I'd be willing to kind of engage in something with the community to get their input and to kind of be in discussion with them if we can't kind of do everything that we kind of had set up. And so just to kind of figure out how we can support making something happen to include the communities Commissioner Lamb brought up, as well as maybe any other communities listening now who want to reach out to kind of have a different part of the conversation.
Commissioner Bogus, I appreciate that. I would love to partner with you on that as well.
That's excellent. We as staff will debrief tomorrow and we'll come up with a plan so that we can think about what additional conversations we want to make sure happen in the next month.
We hope you don't have to work after this meeting. Vice President Malika, please.
I'll third that. I want to lift that conversation up mentioned by Commissioner Lamb, and as much support as we can provide, given the capacity that we have. And I know you all are working hard and stretched very thin, but I would also want to echo what she has mentioned around supports for our Chinese and Asian American families who also are out there and need to be heard in terms of this process. Yeah, my closing thoughts and my final question was one around the question you asked in terms of monthly meetings, right? Mm-hmm. So you said monthly meetings, and then what is the current schedule? Are we doing quarterly meetings or bi-monthly? That was my question, and then my comment was for me, the answers are always in the community with the parents, right? And so continuously doing that work, parent engagement, community engagement, I think is going to get us hopefully as close as we can get to building out a system that reflects the hearts and desires of the students and families that we serve. But going back to the question in terms of logistics wise, what are we currently set up for? Is it quarterly or bi-monthly or?
Well, we don't have anything on the books for January of starting in 2022. So we just, for this semester, we had decided that, 2 meetings was just right. The reason we're thinking monthly moving forward, and I appreciate your comment, Commissioner Maliga, I absolutely agree, community input is essential to this. I also just think that this work is so complex and important that I wouldn't want staff to be working with the community and getting too far down a path without like regular workshops with the board. So I love these meetings because I consider them workshops, right? Where we're able to, like the feedback you've given us tonight, just like at the last meeting, improves how we approach this work. And so I think, so that's one reason, just wanting to make sure we're going on a path in a way that's aligned with the board's expectation. The second is, it's a ton of information. So if we only meet, if we meet infrequently, I just worry it'll be like a fire hose. Like we'll have so much we want to share with the board that it'll just be, hard to do that. And the third thing is, I think it's accountability and transparency. If we're meeting with you on a monthly basis, we're backwards mapping from that. We're working to make sure we're meeting the milestones, and it helps us. So, and it also provides the community with transparency at every stage of the process. So that was why we were thinking monthly meetings. It was kind of an monthly meetings would be helpful to that. But obviously we recognize your time is invaluable, and we'll take whatever meeting sequence you think is appropriate. But that was our thinking about why we should meet monthly.
Okay. Yeah, for me, as long as the meetings are planned out and they're not redundant based off of the month before, and they're productive and effective, then and it moves us closer to the timeline, I think, we should consider it. But if it's one of those things where, we don't have anything to report for, say, the month after, it'd be a good conversation to have with the chair, but I'm open. But I know it was a question that you posed earlier, and so I just wanted to bring it back to light.
Thank you.
Thank you for that, Commissioner Vice President Maliga. I guess too, in that I would propose maybe, I think I'm hesitant to say that we should meet every month in the spring, just because I feel like this is very important, but the budget is just very much the trump card. And I just think that there's going to be some months where this will just not kind of be something that we can prioritize as much. But I would want to maybe offer up that we start the next year with a meeting in January and February. And then at that point, maybe we can kind of do a reassessing if it makes sense to do it every other month or something to that effect. Especially that'll give us a little extra time as the new year starts to have public give some input kind of on our workshop meetings that we kind of have here. And so I guess if committee members don't have an issue with us kind of having that as our template, I'll follow up offline and we can kind of finalize things. Maybe that could be a starting place for us. I had some additional questions that I was kind of hoping we could talk about a little bit. I guess I'm worried about, and I know this is a model metric and it's not kind of perfected, but I feel that the use of it and the modeling is concerning for me around the free and reduced lunch. I feel like the issue we have in our school district that doesn't catch is like the wealth gap in our schools, like where that does catch how many like low income families we have, it doesn't capture how many wealthy families we have. And that is where the ability to add additional staffing and supports to schools come from. And so I think like for me, it's like, well, then how do we balance, the different abilities of PTAs, across the city to really make sure that, all of our schools are equitable, like, do we have to match what a PTA on the west side does for schools on the east side? And does us making a commitment to zones mean that that's something that we need to think about or offer up? And so I guess I just wanted to offer that up and see if there's any thoughts that you had on if that is something that you feel like is catchable, kind of the wealth side of the income aspect, or if that is actually something that kind of exists outside of kind of our data capturing.
So there are multiple data sources that we can use, and we have looked at multiple measures for income. So if you think about, the census data that's available that we can use, because again, we're not thinking about the individual student characteristics, but rather the characteristics of profiles within census blocks, and how to employ that as part of it. So Irene, I don't know if you want to elaborate a little there and talk about some of the other metrics that we have been looking at.
Can I just jump in before you respond? I think I'm just curious of like, how are we matching census blocks to the school population? Just kind of knowing that in San Francisco, wealthy families will kind of pick and choose public schools. And then if they don't get access, they'll kind of jettison out, which will kind of create a different balance between kind of the income level of maybe the census tract that the school is in and the school population. Or I guess, how are we balancing, I guess, those thoughts?
Irene, if you don't mind sharing a little bit too in your response about the conversations we've had about gentrification, as well as the red line districts, just to give the commissioners a broader sense of the types of conversations we're having.
Yeah, really appreciate this very nuanced point, Commissioner Bogus. One of the reasons we have been starting with free and reduced price lunch as the sort of first measure is because we do have regularly updated data on this measure. And so there are a bunch of other measures we could consider as well, including median household income, other measures of poverty. We've suggested a couple of times to have better measures of potential PTA, like quantity of PTA funds. It's not clear where we can get that data. And so we're kind of working with what we have, keeping in mind that we want to be measuring both, the poorer families, but also richer families. And so, as Orla mentioned, one thing we have been doing is engaging with some researchers at Stanford who specialize in gentrification, thinking about when we change school assignment policies, what effects that might have on where families move, the potential impacts on students, for example, instability. And so, yeah, I guess the short answer to your question is it's a really good question, and we're still figuring out what the best way is to capture that effect.
I appreciate that. Thank you. My next question, I think it's something that I maybe brought up before, but I think just kind of thinking about the way the zones are set up and kind of the population imbalance in the city, and just saying kind of there are parts of the city where there's just less people, there's just less density, and how that is going to impact, I guess, the way that we're thinking about zones and transportation supports, and matching that with the fact that people have a preference for schools on the west side. And how we're going to kind of, I guess, balance all of those things with there's more people kind of on the east and the south side of the city. More people want to go to schools on the west side. West side schools tend to find additional resources to kind of what they get from the weighted student formula that our district offers them to provide additional resources. So I guess, how do you take that into consideration at this point of kind of what we're doing, and what does that mean for, I guess, the requests of people who live in denser parts of the city? Like, should there be an expectation then for them that they would be more likely having to travel further, or is that not something that folks would have to expect, or is that not something we would be able to figure out at this point?
I feel like your question, Commissioner, touches on each and every one of the complexities that are associated with this, both in terms of historical demand patterns, of which the district has played a role in creating, where, at least since the 70s, we've been having kind of an exit strategy as a way to create more diversity and address some of the inequities in our school system, prioritizing with, transportation and 94124 priorities and all of that. And part of what we're trying to do is disrupt that and to create greater opportunity for families to have the experiences they want, desire, and deserve, and closer to home, and not feeling like they have to travel and leave their community in order to get the educational experiences they want. But it took us since the 70s to get here, so we're not going to change it overnight either. And it might well be that we end up coming up with a a recommendation around zones with a bunch of like dependencies and contingencies that before we would actually implement them, certain things would need to be true, right? And that could be part of the approach that we take to getting to the place that we want to be ultimately. When we look at the demand patterns for families in the Southeast, they're fairly proximate. We're not seeing huge numbers of families in the Southeast requesting schools on the West Side. They're kind of requesting them, you know, not exactly in the Southeast, but closer to the Southeast than to the West Side. So for example, in 94124, one of the most requested schools is E.R. Taylor, which is just the other side of the highway. It's not, you know, it's not Jefferson, right? Or Sunset. And so that's what's great about the tool that Stanford have developed that will try to kind of predict what choice patterns might look like within different zone options, and then see who's going to be most impacted. How are choices going to be disrupted, and who's going to have their choices most disrupted? I'm going to pause because I'm not sure I'm answering your question.
No, you are. Was that true also for second and third choices, that they were majority kind of local and nearby? Because I guess that's what I would wonder about, if like all of parents' choices fall into that categories. Because I think there's always the one school you want to go to, and then it's kind of like, no, I gotta get away from here and go to a different type of experience. And so I guess just how we're trying to kind of capture and measure that.
Right.
Because I think that's the trickier part of it. And I guess what you're saying is, the way things are set up now would mean that it's less likely that there would be an issue of people who live in a more populous area, kind of like the Southeast, where there's more families and children, of having longer commutes because they are kind of around more people versus people who are kind of less densely packed and would, you know, and have more accessibility. I guess, is that what you're saying?
Yeah, and I also think the strategic location of programs is so important. So we have, for example, in the center of the city, which is actually ideal because it means whether you're north, south, east, or west, it's, you know, it's easier to get to a unique program in the center of the city. But that's not where we're seeing that's where we're seeing huge demand, but not necessarily a high density of school-age children. So we need to rethink, you know, our K-8, like our children traveling because they want access to language pathways, special education pathways, to K-8 pathways. So just kind of really understand, and that's why one of our strands of work is really kind of analyzing and unpacking and deepening our understanding of what are the demand patterns telling us. For years and years and years, we've got demand patterns. We need to evaluate them to have a better understanding of what families' needs and desires are, and then think about how do we meet those needs? Like what is it that families are looking for, and how can we create those opportunities?
No, I do agree in figuring out how we can reallocate resources to do that. When you talk about the center of the city, are you talking the geographic center of the city, or kind of the center of kind of where our population mass is distributed in the city? I just feel like, as someone who grew up on the edge of the city, getting to the middle of the city is like almost impossible if you're kind of on the edges. Just the way the city is set up, it gets really tricky. And so I guess just with those kind of considerations of like, do we need to actually think with our zones of like, if you are on the periphery or the edge of the city, like that there needs to be some different or separate type of consideration taken into account for that, as you know, as we think about all the transportation pieces. But thank you so much for answering my question. My next question is around the groups. As we try to think about what groups of people we have in zones, I'm curious as to what groups you feel like we have the ability to kind of control, like the numbers or percentages within the zones, like through the kind of creation of the zones. Does that make sense? Like, as we think about the different student populations we're prioritizing and how we're creating, like what things can we take into account? Like, can we look at like racial aspects of students, which I think is a part of our weighted student formula? It looks like we're looking at free and reduced lunch. Are we also looking at the number of special education students, or is that something that we would actually say we're going to pull out later and treat as a separate group? I guess, how do we control the creations of equity in the zones? That question does not feel well put together, but if you understand it, let me know. If not, we can run away from it.
I think I understand it, that you're wondering about, there's multiple ways to, measure diversity and to think about equity and access for different student populations. And so how are we folding that into the creation of the zones? And I'm going to let Irene elaborate, but I will say that, we're looking at multiple measures. Tonight, we intentionally simplified in order to be able to illustrate some of the key questions that we'd love input and responses to, but there are multiple measures we're looking at, and there's also a variety of metrics we're using to evaluate different options. So we will have input, we'll have things that we put in. There are these levers and decisions we have to make as that we put in to simulate zones, right? So you think of there's a set of inputs, you do an activity to generate some zones, and then you evaluate those zones to see, are they something we would even contemplate? And part of the evaluation includes looking at, the distribution of English learners, students with IEPs, and just a variety of characteristics that will help us understand. And then we will take those insights and say, okay, well, we need to adjust the inputs now, and let's run another simulation because that first one didn't work and we're not hitting these targets. So let's try it this way. And we imagine doing multiple iterations like that before we bring something out that we would feel is representative of what the community wants and the board wants. And then we'd evaluate that and get feedback on it.
I think you answered my question well. Thank you for helping me say it right and then answering it. That's good. I think what I'm also interested in as when we come back is figuring out how much weight each of those levers have so that when we pull it, we kind of know the impact it'll have. Because I just feel like they're not going to be equal in the way that we're able to access them, and having that information I feel is really vital. I'm going to wrap up my questions, my time with some statements and some answers to the questions that you put forward. I think the things that I would like to see is like a cost estimate, and I don't know if this is already included, but for like an ongoing position for the community engagement related to this process. Like, I don't know if that is set to end when this process ends, but for me, that's key. And for that position to hold some assessment matrix tools to give us direction from the community, the advisory councils back, even though we're not supposed to spend more money right now. I think I also want us to take into consideration as we get closer to zones, how we are going to incorporate after school programming and other city services that people rely on and incorporate that into the development of our zones. There can be some alignment. I also want to hear from the team collectively on the data gaps and the limitations of the data that we have. Like when you brought up what the issue was around information about PTAs and how that could actually shift from year to year or from, student cohort to student cohort. Because I think for us as a board, knowing where data won't give us answers will allow for us to make the decisions and make the hard choices. One thing for me also, just where I'm at right now, I think we need a plan to go from bigger zones to smaller zones. Like, I think for me, I kind of see a multi-tier process where in this initial moment, the idea of having zones that are longer and kind of connect more parts of the city together to help create equity across the city seems like a positive to me, but I think it goes against our goal of having like schools people can walk to, and like how do we get more time to get there. And so in response to your questions, I think I'm for a modified version of the representative model, where we look at groups below 12% and treat them special to ensure they're not isolated or minimized. But I do think that would mess up the weighted student formula because it could disproportionately make schools get less money because of the students they have. I think I do support us going to a monthly for January and February, and then if everything is going well, going to kind of a every other month model from there. And I think the big ask I have is what additional costs around this do we kind of need to think about? Like, I think I've identified a cost to monitor. I'm thinking about costs to like monitor and maintain this system moving forward if we need to kind of tweak it. I'm also thinking like, are there any additional transportation costs that could arise from this that we kind of need to think about or take into consideration? And I think those are kind of like the big things for me that stand out. I appreciate all the work that folks have put forward. And I think for me, I'm really interested in us being able to show maps to the public and really excited about that. Every time I see the maps that you show and they show people going from east to west and west to east, I just scream because that's so hard to do in San Francisco. And so I think really having something to show people and letting them yell at us about it until we get it right will be really helpful for what we're trying to do. And so I think with that, I will end board comment and we'll take our last few minutes to see if we have any public comment from the public. And then Orla, I'll maybe give you a moment to close out and say any final words if you have any.
Thank you.
Is there anybody who wants to speak that hasn't spoken already? Can you please translate that?
Por favor, si tienen algo que decir y todavía no lo han hecho y quieren hacerlo, por favor aprovechen este momento para hacerlo. Muchas gracias.
如果你想對呢個剛才講嘅政策發表意見，而你之前未發表意見嘅話咧，你可以而家舉手嚟發表你嘅意見，你發表你嘅意見嘅。唔該晒 ，thank you。
Seeing none, Commissioner.
Thank you, public, for being
Commissioner
patient.
Bogus, sorry. If they could say, if you press *9, those who are on the phone, if they wanted to speak, they could raise their hand too. Sorry.
No, thank you for that. Is that something we could also have translated, interpreted if that's appropriate?
Si quieren levantar la mano pero no ven el icono, pueden apretar estrella y 9 y de esta manera desaparecerá la mano levantada en caso de que quieran hacer un comentario público. Muchas gracias.
如果你打電話喺 Zoom 度打電話入嚟嘅，你係想發言嘅話咧，你可以撳星9，咁咧就可以舉手話到俾我哋知，就話你係上呢個公眾發言嘅。唔該晒 ，thank you。
Seeing one, Commissioner.
Okay, 1 minute, please.
Jen?
Hello? I'm sorry, can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. I just wanted to say a real quick comment that one thing that happened to me was my son, because he's older, he was no longer considered part of the family. And so it created basically kind of like, oh my God, he would have to go to a separate school. And if I have multiple, I have 4 kids, then it became to the point where, all right, if I'm lucky, you know, the second oldest, whatever school she gets into, and the little ones can follow, or else I would essentially, if she goes to another school, basically I could potentially be going around to like 3 different schools. So I was wondering if everybody can consider in the future, please keep family together. That would be really appreciated. I know there's a lot of things to consider, but that was just really hard on me. Thank you.
Thank you for that. And that will, I believe, end public comment. Orla, I think I would love if you could just share with the public if they do want to reach out to us about doing some specific language community stuff, like who's the best person to reach out to. And also, I would love if there was a way for us to develop like a frequently asked questions that are coming up from the community members, just so that we can have those to kind of see what came up for folks and how we're responding to it.
Absolutely, we'll do the FAQ and the sfusd.edu/student assignment. We're updating that. When you go on it, you'll see you can sign in if you want to be part of an email distribution. We're going to be doing regular newsletters to keep people updated. So that's for the community. If you want to participate, you know, sign up to that for the newsletter. And we will add the FAQ to that webpage. There's also a dedicated page for the Ad Hoc Committee on Student Assignment, sfusd.edu/ad hoc committee. And you can see all of the resources and conversations from prior meetings on that. Ms. Robinson, do you want to, is there a particular email that people should, if there's anyone listening and they want to reach out about scheduling a conversation?
Sure. You can connect with me at Robinson, ROBINSON MONM as in Mary, and the number 1 at sfusd.edu.
Thank you. You are number 1. That's great. And Commissioner Bogus, I want to thank you for the meeting, and thank you, Commissioners Maliga and Lamb as well. I really appreciate these conversations. They are workshop sessions, public workshop sessions for full transparency that we invite the community to participate and help refine our thinking as we're moving forward. I also really want to thank Professor Lowe and the team members who are here tonight and team members who are not here tonight. There's a big effort behind this paradigm shift that we're working to create, and we couldn't do it without all the partnerships that exist. I'll follow up maybe one-on-one with you, Commissioner Bogus, to think about like what the dates are and the specific scope and sequence for the January and February and future meetings. And then commissioners, all 3 commissioners will follow up before the end of the week with the commitment to making sure that there's more opportunities for our monolingual Chinese families to provide input at this stage in the process.
Thank you so much. Very much appreciation to you, your team, all the folks who are helping, the public who's giving their input to help guide us in the right direction. And I'm confident that we'll get this right and we will make things better for folks. So with that, we will adjourn this committee meeting and wish everyone a good night.
Thank you so much.
Night.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.